we can solve the mystery beyond doubt of who this skeleton actually is. None other than Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe, Egyptian rebel, Queen of Egypt.
We are told she was the most beautiful woman in history, but new DNA analysis and forensic reconstruction suggest a terrifying alternative. The last pharaoh may have been a genetic time bomb. The DNA of Cleopatra has finally been analyzed, and what it revealed is terrifying. It seems that her greatest battle wasn't against Rome, but against her own biology. To fully understand the rave about Cleopatra's DNA being analyzed, we have to start with one woman. The Martinez breakthrough, the geometric miracle. For 2,000 years, the sands of Egypt have held on to one specific secret, a secret that has baffled historians and treasure hunters for centuries. We are talking about the final resting place of the last pharaoh, Queen Cleopatra. Usually, most experts will tell you she's gone. They say she's buried under the modern streets of Alexandria, lost forever to earthquakes and rising tides. But for the last 20 years, one woman dared to say they were all wrong. That woman was Kathleen Martinez. Martinez isn't your typical academic in a tweed jacket. She's a criminal lawyer turned archaeologist from the Dominican Republic. And she didn't approach this like a history lesson. She approached it like a cold case homicide. She treated Cleopatra's disappearance like a crime scene that needed to be deciphered. While everyone was looking left, Martinez looked right. Her profile of the suspect led her 30 miles west of Alexandria to a forgotten, crumbling temple called Taposiris Magna. And in 2022, the ground beneath her feet finally revealed a massive anomaly. Martinez and her team smashed through the limestone and found something that shouldn't exist. A tunnel. But not just any tunnel. This thing is a shocking replica. It's carved through solid bedrock, stretching over 4,300 feet. That's nearly a mile long. It's 6 feet high, submerged in mud and water, and it heads straight out toward the Mediterranean Sea. Architects are calling it a geometric miracle. It is an engineering masterpiece that matches the legendary ancient Greek tunnel of Eupalinos. But here's the million-dollar question: why? Why go to this extreme? Why tunnel 40 feet underground into unstable, dangerous rock? You don't build a mile-long aqueduct for a minor site. This implies importance. The discovery of a sunken port off the coast suggests this wasn't just a remote temple. It was a hub, and Martinez believes this tunnel leads to the end of the line. Martinez's theory is terrifyingly simple. Cleopatra wasn't just hiding from death. She was hiding from Rome. She was hiding from the humiliation of being paraded in chains by Octavian. She wanted to be buried with her lover, Mark Antony. She wanted to be immortalized as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis. And to do that, she needed a tomb that could never, ever be defiled. She buried herself where she thought no one would ever look. Kathleen Martinez may have found the front door to that sanctuary. And while we haven't found the queen yet, the evidence we have uncovered points to a dark truth about her dynasty, the clue of the golden tongues inside the complex. The team made another discovery that sent shivers down their spines. Buried in 16 rock-cut tombs were mummies. But these weren't ordinary burials. When the archaeologists peered into the crumbling faces of the dead, they saw something glittering in the darkness. Gold. Inside their mouths, where their tongues should have been, were amulets made of gold foil. The ancient Egyptians believed that to survive the afterlife, you had to speak to Osiris, the lord of the underworld. You had to plead your case. A golden tongue gives the power to speak to a god. It grants what is called golden eloquence. But why are they here? Why at this specific temple? Martinez believes these weren't just random aristocrats. They were Cleopatra's people, her inner circle, her courtiers. They were buried here, equipped with the magic to speak to Osiris, perhaps to announce the arrival of their queen. Think about what that means. We aren't just digging through a graveyard. We are standing in a royal reception hall. We are in her necropolis. And if the courtiers are here, waiting for their queen, the door is about to open. Despite Martinez's discovery, she is inches away from the queen's DNA. But while we wait for her to break the final seal, we already have a key to Cleopatra's genetic code. Or so we thought. To see Cleopatra's face, we don't need to wait for the tunnel. We just need to look at the bones of the sister she murdered the blood rival to understand the dead found at Taposiris Magna we first have to understand the ruthlessness of the woman they served. History remembers Cleopatra as the seductress, but her family tree was more like a shark tank. And her biggest threat wasn't a Roman general. It was her own little sister, Arsinoe IV. This was a relationship defined by pure, toxic ambition. When Cleopatra was exiled, it was Arsinoe who took the throne. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, it was Arsinoe who led the army against him. She was a warrior princess who actually managed to trap Caesar in the palace. But history is written by the victors. Arsinoe was eventually captured, dragged to Rome, and forced to march in chains during Caesar's triumphal procession. The Roman crowds actually wept for her, a teenage girl in shackles. That sympathy saved her life, and she was exiled to the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, in modern-day Turkey. She thought she was safe. She thought she was safe. She thought the holy ground would protect her. She was wrong. In 41 BCE, Cleopatra persuaded Mark Antony to do the unthinkable. He sent assassins to the temple steps. They dragged Arsinoe out and slaughtered her. It was a scandal that rocked the ancient world. But for us, 2,000 years later, it provided a location. We knew exactly where the crime occurred. For centuries, we thought Arsinoe was lost to history, until the 1900s, when archaeologists in Ephesus found a unique tomb known as the Octagon. Inside was a skeleton. The bones belonged to a young person. For decades, and if their theory was correct, this may just be the remains of Arsinoe IV. The timeline fits. The location fit. The age fits. If this was Arsinoe, we had Cleopatra's genetic code. We could finally answer the questions about her ethnicity, her health, her lineage. We had the map to the queen's biology. But science has a way of ruining a good story. Initial DNA tests failed due to contamination. The bones had been handled too many times. But recently, in a 2025 study, advanced analysis finally gave us an answer. And it wasn't what anyone expected. The African hypothesis. To understand why the 2025 results were such a shock, you have to understand the massive weight this skeleton was carrying. This wasn't just about identifying a sister. It was about rewriting the identity of the queen herself. The controversy started with the tomb itself. The tomb is an octagon. In the ancient world, that shape was a signal. It alluded to the most famous building in Alexandria, the Pharos Lighthouse. Archaeologist Hilke Thursday connected the dots. She argued that an octagonal tomb in Ephesus, the very city where Arsinoe was murdered, must belong to the exiled princess. The architecture was a stone fingerprint pointing back to the royal family. But the theory didn't stop at architecture. It moved to biology. The original skull found in 1929 had a chaotic history. It was lost in Germany during the bombings of World War II, only to be miraculously rediscovered in the University of Vienna archives in 2022. But before it was lost, measurements and photographs were taken. And based on those old records, Thursday dropped a bombshell. She claimed the skull measurements suggested the deceased had an African mother. This was the spark that ignited a firestorm. If Arsinoe had an African mother, and she shared a father with Cleopatra, then Cleopatra herself, often depicted as purely Macedonian Greek, could have been mixed race. This idea has powerful backers. For decades, writers like J. A. Rogers and Chaikinta Diop have argued that history has whitewashed Egypt. They point to the African roots of Egyptian civilization. More recently, pop culture, like the 2023 Netflix docuseries, brought this debate into millions of living rooms, casting a black actress to portray the queen. For proponents of a black Cleopatra, the skeleton in Ephesus was the smoking gun. It was the only piece of physical evidence that challenged the mainstream consensus that the Ptolemies were an inbred Greek dynasty. But the 2025 analysis didn't just change the gender of the skeleton. It dismantled the racial hypothesis entirely. The cracked mirror for years, this skeleton in Ephesus, was our only mirror to Cleopatra's face. Scholars looked at those bones and saw a queen's sister. They saw African heritage. They saw the answer to a centuries-old riddle. But recently, modern technology took a second look, and the mirror cracked. The breakthrough happened in 2022. A team from the University of Vienna, led by anthropologist Gerhard Weber, finally located the long-lost skull in the university archives. It had been sitting there, unnoticed, for decades. This was the game changer. They didn't just look at it, they saw through it. Using micro-CT scans, they created a high-resolution digital map of the bone structure, and they drilled into the petrous temporal bone, the densest part of the skull, a biological safe that preserves DNA even when the rest of the skeleton has turned to dust. In January 2025, the results were published in scientific reports, and they revealed a medical horror story. The skeleton isn't Arsino. It isn't a 20-year-old woman. It isn't an African princess. The DNA proved the presence of a Y chromosome. The sister of Cleopatra is a boy, specifically an adolescent boy between 11 and 14 years old. And he wasn't just young. He was suffering. The scans revealed severe developmental disorders. His jaw was stunted. His skull was asymmetrical and twisted. The analysis suggests he suffered from something like Treacher-Collins syndrome or severe rickets. This wasn't a healthy royal rival. This was a child with a face that had been misshapen by genetic tragedy. Even more shocking was that his DNA tells us he wasn't from Egypt. His genetic markers trace back to Italy or Sardinia. This opens up a darker, more confusing mystery. We thought we were looking at the victim of a political assassination. Instead, we're looking at a tragedy of a different kind. The octagon turned out to be a heroine, a tomb built for a hero, a semi-divine figure. Why was a deformed, sickly Italian boy buried in one of the most prestigious tombs in the ancient world? Was he a scapegoat, a sacrifice, or was he a hidden royal bastard, a child of Roman and Ptolemaic blood whose existence was so shameful or so dangerous that he had to be buried with honors, but far away from home? Whatever the answer is, it turns out that the scientific proof of Cleopatra's African lineage in this specific tomb was an illusion caused by bad science and wishful thinking. So where does that leave us? We are back to the historical record, and the record tells us that Cleopatra was the product of the Ptolemaic dynasty. And if you want to know what she really looked like, you don't need to find her body. You just need to look at the terrifying family tree she climbed to get to the throne. Because while we don't have her DNA, we know exactly who her parents were, and that reality is far darker than any debate about skin color. The boy in Ephesus might have been a secret, but in Alexandria, the genetic nightmare wasn't a secret. It was royal policy, characterized by what is called pedigree collapse. In a normal family tree, the branches expand upward. You have 2 parents. For grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. The further back you go, the more ancestors you have. It's a funnel opening up to the world. But Cleopatra's family tree didn't expand. It collapsed in on itself. The Ptolemies were a Greek dynasty ruling Egypt. They wanted to keep their power absolute and their bloodline pure. So they adopted the ancient pharaonic custom of incest. They didn't just marry cousins. They married siblings. Historians believe Cleopatra's own parents, Ptolemy XII and Cleopatra V, were likely full siblings. Even her grandparents may have most likely been uncle and niece, or even brother and sister. This family was obviously a closed loop. Geneticists estimate that Cleopatra was born with the coefficient of inbreeding estimated at over 45%. To put that in perspective, the child of 2 first cousins has about a 6% coefficient. In many royal dynasties, like the Habsburgs of Spain, this level of inbreeding led to severe deformities, infertility, and madness. For example, Charles II of Spain, the Habsburg king whose autopsy stated his heart was the size of a peppercorn due to inbreeding. Historians call him the Bewitched. He was the end of the Habsburg line, a dynasty that practiced the same kind of intermarriage as the Ptolemies. Charles was a medical tragedy. He couldn't speak until he was 4. He couldn't walk until he was 8. His jaw was so deformed, a condition called mandibular prognathism, that his top and bottom teeth couldn't touch. He literally could not chew his food. He swallowed everything whole. He was baffled by simple conversations, plagued by seizures, and physically frail. When he died at age 38, the autopsy report stated that his body did not contain a single drop of blood. His head was full of water, and his heart was the size of a peppercorn. His coefficient of inbreeding was around 25%. Cleopatra was nearly double that. So why does this happen? The science comes down to something called homozygosity. Normally, your DNA is a conversation between your mother and father. One covers the flaws of the other. If your mother passes down a recessive gene for a weakness or a disease, your father usually passes down a dominant gene for strength to cancel it out. It's a biological safety net. But in Cleopatra's case, there was no conversation. The same genes, repeating the same errors over and over. Because her parents were siblings, they carried the exact same genetic flaws. There was no healthy gene to step in and save her. Biologically, she should have been a disaster. Inbreeding like this usually results in the kind of deformities we saw in that boy in Ephesus: physical weakness, cognitive issues, short lifespans. But here is the terrifying paradox. History tells us Cleopatra wasn't deformed. She was brilliant. She spoke 9 languages. She charmed the most powerful men in Rome. She led armies. So how? Was she a genetic miracle? A 1 in a million roll of the biological dice? Or have we been missing the signs of her suffering all along? To understand if she was a victim, we have to look at the perpetrators, her ancestors. If you want to know what Cleopatra was fighting against, look at her great-granduncle, Ptolemy VIII. This was Cleopatra's great-granduncle, but because of the incestuous family tree, he is also a direct genetic mirror, and he was a medical catastrophe. They called him Fisgon, which translates to potbelly. But that was being polite. Historical records describe him as morbidly obese, with limbs that were too weak to support his massive frame. He had to be walked around by supporters. He wore thin, transparent robes that horrified the Roman visitors. But look closer at the descriptions. It wasn't just fat. Sources mention a swollen neck, prominent bulging eyes, shortness of breath. Then look at Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, the flute player. He was described as self-indulgent, weak, and physically soft. These aren't just character flaws. These are symptoms. Modern medical historians looking at the Ptolemaic dynasty see a pattern of genetic metabolic disorders. They see evidence of multi-organ fibrotic conditions. They see a family line plagued by obesity and lethargy. And most terrifying of all, they see the markers of Graves' disease, an autoimmune disorder that attacks the thyroid. It causes exophthalmos, bulging eyes, and a goiter, swollen neck. And here is where the diagnosis gets terrifying. Graves' disease doesn't just affect the way you look. It affects the way you act. It floods the body with thyroid hormones, creating a state of hyperstimulation. Symptoms include manic energy, rapid speech, insomnia, and erratic, high-stakes behavior. Does that sound familiar? Historians have always praised Cleopatra for her boundless vitality. They say she could work all night, that she was constantly on the move. We have framed this as genius. But medical anthropologists are now asking a darker question. Was Cleopatra's legendary energy actually a symptom? Was the fire inside her a result of a genetic thyroid storm passed down from her uncle? Let's look at the physical evidence we do have. Starting with the coins. When we analyze the silver tetradrachms minted during her reign, we see the family traits manifesting. Cleopatra has the Ptolemaic nose, a strong, hooked aquiline nose. She has a prominent, jutting chin. She has a thick neck. These aren't the features of a delicate beauty queen. These are the features of a survivor. But beneath the surface, the genetic bomb was ticking. The Ptolemaic line was plagued by fibrodysplasia and bone density issues. In highly inbred populations, the skeletal structure often weakens. The jaw malforms, just like we saw with the boy in Ephesus. And what about the propensity of obesity? Ptolemy VIII was a potbelly. Did Cleopatra inherit the gene? Some experts speculate that her famous petite stature wasn't natural. It was a war. If she had the genetic predisposition for the morbid obesity that crippled her uncle, her life would have been a constant, starving battle against her own metabolism. Her petite frame might have been the result of hyperthyroidism burning calories at a dangerous rate. So how did she escape? This is the great debate between the medical victim theory and the genetic miracle theory. The first theory insists that Cleopatra was a victim of Ptolemaic inbreeding. This theory argues that she didn't escape. It suggests that while she dodged the deformities, she didn't escape the cost. And the evidence for this comes from an unlikely source, the ancient historian Plutarch. Now, Plutarch never used the words stunted growth. But he left us 2 specific breadcrumbs that medical anthropologists have recently connected. First, the famous carpet scene. Hollywood shows Cleopatra rolling out of a Persian rug, but Plutarch actually writes that she climbed into a bed sack, essentially a linen laundry bag, and was tied up and carried on the back of a single servant, Apollodorus. Think about the physics of that. To be bundled into a sack and carried like a backpack implies she was incredibly light. She wasn't a statuesque Amazon, she was tiny. Second, Plutarch explicitly critiques her appearance. In his Life of Antony, he writes that her actual beauty was not in itself so remarkable. He insists her power came from her voice and her character, not her body. When you layer these ancient clues over a 45% coefficient of inbreeding, petite starts to look a lot like growth restriction. This theory suggests her small stature wasn't just a physical trait. It was a symptom. It argues she was physically frail, perhaps even fighting a body that was trying to fail her, and she used her intellect to compensate for a lack of physical imposingness. The second theory swung the opposite direction, and is a more baffling possibility. In genetics, there's a concept of the roll of the dice. Even with the 45% coefficient of inbreeding, it is statistically possible, though rare, to inherit the clean genes. Let's consider the odds. Cleopatra's siblings were weak. Her brother, Ptolemy XIII, was a child puppet who drowned in the Nile. Her sister Arsinoe was captured and killed. The boy in Ephesus, a possible link to Cleopatra, was deformed. And yet, Cleopatra lived to 39. She bore 4 children, proving she was fertile, which is usually the first thing to vanish in inbred lines. She commanded a navy in battle. She may have been a mosaic survivor. While her family tree was collapsing, she somehow walked through the fire without getting burned. She inherited the intellect of the Greeks and the ruthlessness of the Romans, but she dodged the metabolic collapse of Potbelly and the facial deformities of the boy in Turkey. But we must remember, biology always collects its debt. Even if she didn't have the deformities, she carried the burden. The manic energy, the high-stakes risk-taking, the paranoia, these might not have been personality quirks. They may have been the psychological echoes of a brain wired by centuries of incest. But here's a darker speculation. Whether she was a miracle or a sufferer, Cleopatra knew something was wrong. She grew up watching her family decay. She understood the pattern, and this changes how we view her entire life. Historians usually say Cleopatra seduced Julius Caesar and Mark Antony for political power. They say she wanted Rome's armies. But what if she wanted something more valuable? What if she was seeking fresh DNA? Think about it. Cleopatra was married to her brother, Ptolemy XIII. Then her other brother, Ptolemy XIV. By tradition, she should have had children with them, but she refused. She had no children with her siblings. Instead, she turned to Rome. She turned to Caesar, a man with no relation to her. Then to Antony. What if he wasn't just building an alliance? What if he was executing a biological rescue mission? She knew her bloodline was collapsing. She knew that one more generation of incest would produce monsters, children like the boy in the octagon tomb. She was trying to save her children from the genetic spiral that created her. She was desperately trying to widen the ladder back into a tree. The pharmacologist queen, if we accept the theory that Cleopatra was a medical victim, suffering from the joint pain of inbreeding or the manic tremors of Graves' disease, it raises an impossible question. How did she function? How do you command an army when your bones ache or your thyroid is sending your heart rate through the roof? The answer might lie in a skill historians often overlook. She wasn't just a queen, she was a chemist. We all know the famous story of the pearl. To win a bet against Mark Antony about who could throw the most expensive dinner, she famously took a priceless pearl earring, dropped it into a cup of vinegar, waited for it to dissolve, and drank it. History treats this as a display of decadence. But look at it through the eyes of a scientist. That is a chemical reaction. Calcium carbonate reacting with acetic acid. She understood the properties of matter. And if she understood how to manipulate pearls, she certainly understood how to manipulate plants. If she was living with the chronic pain of pedigree collapse, the same kind of joint and bone agony that plagued the Habsburgs, she likely turned to the royal pharmacy. Egypt was the pharmaceutical capital of the ancient world. If she was in pain, she had access to opium, harvested from the poppy fields of Thebes. It was the ancient world's ultimate painkiller. Did she use it to numb the ache in her genetically compromised joints so she could stand tall during endless diplomatic receptions? If she suffered from the mania and insomnia of Graves' disease, she might have turned to Kifi. This was a complex temple incense, often burned at night, known for its sedative properties. Plutarch wrote that its scent lulled one to sleep and loosened the daily tension like a knot. For a woman possibly trembling with hyperthyroid energy, Kifi wouldn't just be a perfume, it would be medicine. Then there is the blue lotus, a mild psychoactive flower often steeped in wine. It produces a sense of euphoria, a floating feeling. We talk about her legendary charisma, how she could bewitch men with her presence. But was that charisma natural, or was it chemically induced? Was her magnetic, high-energy allure actually a delicate cocktail of blue lotus wine and adrenaline, keeping her floating above the pain of her own body? And finally, consider her face. We know Cleopatra wrote a book on cosmetics called Cosmeticon. Fragments of it were quoted by later doctors like Galen. This shows she wasn't just buying makeup, she was researching it. Why? If the potbelly gene gave her skin issues, or if Graves' disease gave her a goiter, her obsession with cosmetics wasn't vanity. It was camouflage. She may have experimented with kohl just to reshape eyes that might have been too prominent. She may have designed elaborate broad collars and jewelry just to hide a swollen neck. She created ointments, maybe to smooth skin that might have been ravaged by metabolic disorders. She was arguably the world's first biohacker, a brilliant woman trapped in a failing body, using every trick of chemistry, botany, and art to project the image of a living goddess, while privately treating herself like a patient. If Cleopatra spent years carefully painting a lie over her own face, she won the war for her legacy by ensuring that the monster was hidden and only the goddess remained. But right now, 40 feet beneath the bedrock of the Mediterranean coast, Kathleen Martinez is about to do the one thing Cleopatra feared most. She is about to wash off the paint. The tomb awaits, and this brings us back to where we started, deep beneath the Taposiris Magna Temple, where Kathleen Martinez is still digging. For 20 years, she has been hunting for the final resting place of Cleopatra. And thanks to that massive tunnel, the geometric miracle, she is closer than anyone has ever been. But after everything we've analyzed today, the stakes of this discovery have changed. When we started this journey, we were looking for a legend. We were looking for the seductress who charmed Rome, the beauty played by Elizabeth Taylor, the goddess Isis incarnate. But science tells us to prepare for something else. If Martinez breaks through that final wall and finds the sarcophagus, she won't just be uncovering a queen. She will be uncovering a medical archive. She might find a woman who was petite, perhaps frail, hiding her pain behind a mask. She might find a woman who looked less like a movie star and more like a survivor, a woman who fought a war against Rome with her mind, while fighting a war against her own DNA with her pharmacy. Finding Cleopatra won't just rewrite history books. It will rewrite biology textbooks. It will finally answer the question, was she the genetic miracle who escaped the curse, or was she the silent sufferer who ruled in spite of it? For now, the tunnel remains silent. The DNA sequencers are waiting, and the ghost of the last pharaoh is still keeping her secrets. But one thing is certain, the reality of Cleopatra is far more complex and far more terrifying than the myth we fell in love with. And maybe, just maybe, that is exactly how she wanted it. But for now the real question is, if Kathleen Martinez opens that tomb tomorrow, which version of the queen do you think we'll find? Will it be the genetic miracle who defied the odds, or the medical victim who suffered in silence? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. If you enjoyed this video, please click on the next video on your screen.